All right, students, I'm excited to have Brian back to talk about probably one of my favorite topics, honestly. I love this idea of ethics. We talked about way in the beginning of the class. Now we get to talk about when something unethical happens. How do we find out as internal auditors? What's really our role? Who do we have to discuss it with and get involved in fraud if it's actually uncovered at our organization? So Brian, I'm going to kick it over to you. And just in your experience, how do we typically get involved in a fraud investigation? Where have they come from in your career? Is it a tip, a hotline, a management request, an audit finding? I know they can come from all different areas, but where in your experience have they come from?
Yeah, I think that's right, Joe. I think, internal audit, because of our unique positioning in the company, we are the only at Newmont. Now, there are internal audit groups can be structured in various ways, but to a large degree in most publicly traded companies and in most, more mature companies, the internal audit group does not report to management. So what I like to remind people is that at Newmont, we have 25,000 employees and contractors that work for us every day. Tom Palmer, the CEO, reports to the board, and Brian Teets, head of internal audit, reports to the board. So there are only 2 employees in the entire company that don't report directly to management. And so that puts us in an extremely unique position because management cannot hire or fire the internal audit group. At Newmont, internal audit does report dotted line into the CFO, but that's more for just kind of day-to-day budgetary and those kinds of things. But the CFO does not direct the work that I do. That comes directly from the audit committee. And so the reason internal audit is such a valuable resource in investigations is because of our objectivity. We're independent, we're objective, and so we have the opportunity to bring that real skepticism that's absolutely required in an investigation. And not only do we not report to management, but we don't own, as I said in my prior comments, one of the upsides or downsides, depending on how you want to look at it from a professional perspective, is internal audit does not own any business process in the company outside of internal audit. So we don't sign checks, we don't run operations, we don't make decisions on accounting entries. And so it gives us the opportunity to be very objective and skeptical. So I would say that, the reason we get involved is because of our position and our skepticism. At the companies I have worked for, what I have seen probably over the last 10 to 15, 20 years is that fraud investigations and really investigations of any kind are becoming more and more mature, more defined. With all of the whistleblower cases that have happened in corporate America over the years, what I've seen is that in my early career, to your point, Joe, the investigations would kind of happen in lots of different areas in the company. They weren't necessarily always coordinated. But what I've seen is now, and especially at Newmont in 2023, we have a very strong business ethics and integrity group. So we have a chief compliance officer. He is responsible for all investigative activities. So if something comes into internal audit, so an example I would give is we were doing a fuel audit last year. So Newmont, because we're a mining company, we spend lots of money in fuel. And fuel is also a very valuable commodity in these local communities that we operate in, right? So fuel's expensive, and somebody could steal it from the company and resell it and make money. So it's a commodity that is at a high risk of theft and fraud. And so, in our regular audit work, performing work over fuel, we came across a situation where we felt like there was the potential that fuel was being stolen from the company by internal employees. And so in that instance, what is different today than the way it used to be is maybe 15 years ago, internal audit would just expand the scope of its audit and go right into an investigation. What's different today is anytime there is malintent, bad intent on the behalf of an employee, that immediately, at least at Newmont, we take that and move that out of internal audit's oversight, and we put that under the business integrity and ethics group. when it's around internal controls and there's no bad intent, it's just a control deficiency or a control weakness, we don't bring in the business integrity folks. That's just a standard internal audit. We would say, hey, you're not performing reconciliations over your fuel usage. You need to fix that. The moment we see some kind of intent, then we immediately say, okay, that's where internal audit's responsibility stops to manage that. And we give that to the business ethics and integrity group so that they can have full purview over all investigative activities. So I think that's an important and helpful distinction, at least for me over my career, where in the past it might be, well, internal audit, do it or not do it, integrity, do it or not do it. Now it's very clear. And because the company can get in trouble for not following up on these things if there is known bad intent, we want to make sure that the business ethics and integrity group really has full oversight and purview on how these investigations get managed, how they get reported to management. And so what I've really seen, Joe, is that over the years, the ethics department in the company really now has full purview over investigative activities. Now, once we handed that example over, so we were doing an audit and we completed our audit, we made recommendations around internal controls and those things, but we didn't pursue the investigation as part of the audit. It was very clear to our team that was not our purview, that was not the scope of the audit. We focused on internal controls. We handed the investigation over to BI&C. BI&C then goes through a triage, what they call a triage process. Think about a field hospital. What are the most critical patients? What are the, where's the highest impact? They go through a process on every single hotline case that comes in, and they determine what's the level of urgency, who's the best function to help investigate. We have times when HR performs investigations, our security team. So at all of our sites around the globe, we have security teams to protect the environment and make sure that people don't come into our mine sites and get hurt, but also to protect the very valuable gold bullion that gets mined at these locations. So the security team can get pulled into investigations. And of course, internal audit, and then BI&C, the business integrity group, can do them themselves. So when we found this fuel issue, we gave it to the BI&C team. They did a triage, and then they came right back to us and said, hey, internal audit, we want you to perform this investigation. So I just give that as an example of, I think from an internal audit perspective, you really have to understand the scope of your work. And for me, what's been very helpful is that anytime there is malintent or intentionality to defraud the company, I immediately hand that over to our BI&C group. If it's poor controls, poor management, gaps in controls, that's clearly in my purview. I'll write the report, get action plans for management. But I just think that's a really, really important concept when it comes to investigation. So,
yeah.
So go ahead, Joe. Yeah.
No, I completely agree. And I think it's good for the students to understand it's almost its own profession, right?
Yes.
And it depends on what it is. We could talk about forensic accounting being something completely different, but fraud investigations, in my mind, take a certain skill set, and it does completely depend on what it is. So I love that you've kind of built this model at Newmont to have somebody with the consistency, the purview to see, are we treating all of these consistently, and then bringing in the players that we need to do the work. I know I've done a few what I would consider fraud investigations in my career in financial services, but they have been things like, an employee working way too much overtime, for even hours in the week. And so it was a lot of data analytics and pulling down time reports. And that is very much in my mind in the skill set of an internal auditor, right? And so I think it is, like you said, important to just know who are the best people equipped to do that fraud investigation. And so, what skills do you think of, maybe getting into a little bit more of the skill sets internal auditors need, to do a fraud investigation? Is there anything that your team has that you feel like is a little unique?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And so depending on, so part of the triage process is so just to step back one step, where do these come in? I gave one example.
Oh, yeah.
This came in through an audit. That's one avenue. But where most of our investigation activity comes from is, like most companies, we have a hotline, so an integrity hotline. We also encourage employees to report up through their management. And if I, as a manager, have an employee come to me, I am then instructed to go to BINC and make that report. So it all still ends up in BINC, but so investigations come from all over. We even have investigations come from outside the company, right? So we'll have vendors call us and say, hey, I think something's going on. So, but the important part for me is that they all get sent to one place. And that's a management responsibility. It's not an internal audit responsibility. So I think it's the right answer. It goes to BINC. Now, if I had concerns that BINC was hiding things or suppressing things, I would have to take matters into my hands differently, because I would then have a process that's not operating effectively. And I would have to make management aware that I think there are gaps in the effectiveness of BINC. But as long as I feel like the BINC group is effectively managing its process, I have no problems that they have full purview, full oversight of these investigations. And then they do a triage process. Like I said, they identify the right skill set. So if it's a harmful behavior, bullying, harassment, that kind of thing, of course, it goes to HR. They're the experts in dealing with those types of things. If it's theft on site, so somebody's taking scrap metals or things from the site, typically that's our security team. They're the experts on the ground. Internal audit can get involved in those. But then, if it's anything around fraud or malfeasance around anything around books and records of the company, supply chain issues, that kind of thing, internal audit definitely gets involved. And so what are the skill sets? I would say, number one, Joe, you have to be objective. You have to be independent. So the first thing we do on any investigation is make sure that even on the internal audit team that we're assigning to it, that we don't have any potential perceived conflicts of interest for some reason over the investigation. Now, because of our role, that typically isn't an issue, but you have to be objective. And then a lot of the people on our teams, because we do a significant number of investigations at Newmont, about 15 to 25, depending on the year, 15% to 25% of our time is spent on investigations. So if you take all of the work we do, 15 to 25% of our full year is spent doing investigation work. And so a number of our team members are certified fraud examiners. Of course, if you're a CIA, you're a certified internal auditor, there's skill sets there. And really, the skill set you need is to be able to sit down and map out the process, understand the scenario that you're looking at. What are the allegations? Make sure that those allegations are clear, gather the facts, but really understand the internal business processes that are there to prevent this type of activity. And many times what you find is that there's a lapse in some control that should have been performed. Many times in supply chain, you're supposed to go through a bidding process to award work to a vendor. There are exception processes in our supply chain process where if there's an urgent need in the business, or you've worked with a vendor before and you've got a short deadline, you don't have to necessarily go through the bidding process. You can do what's called a sole source justification. We find many times people overuse that exception to cover up bad behavior. So that's just an example of where a control is in place, but that control has been circumvented. So as an internal auditor, the value we bring is we know the policies and procedures of the company. And so we know when we're evaluating an investigation, because we're experts at what the company's requirements are, we can quickly identify, well, wait a minute, there was supposed to be a bid document. There was supposed to be a sign off. The wrong person signed off and reviewed this. The access controls were not right. So we know what those controls are supposed to be. So as an internal auditor, you bring a ton of experience because of the internal systems of the company. And then the other thing that I think internal auditors have that not necessarily other functions in the company have is to a great degree is the ability to interview. So one of the most important, in addition to gathering data and assessing data, whether it's emails or financial transactions, you have to be able to perform interviews to get information. And internal auditors, as part of their day-to-day, not fraud investigation, but just doing internal audit work, what do we spend most of our time doing? It's interviewing functions and process owners How does your process work? What happens here? What happens next? What's the risk? What's the gap? So we're really good at interviewing to get information. And we're good at taking that information in a very skeptical way. So if we get an answer that doesn't jive, we know how to do a follow-up question. So that skill set that we use every day for our regular work 100% helps us to be effective on the investigation work. Because when you do an investigation, you start to identify subjects, people who are involved, and you have to go get information from them. And so the ability to be skeptical, do interviews. And then at the end of the day, an investigation is no different than an audit in that you're pulling all of this information together to come to a conclusion. And at Newmont, we call that it's either substantiated, partially substantiated, or unsubstantiated. You don't have enough evidence to determine that there was, a violation of the code of conduct. So I would say those are the skill sets, Joe. And the more experienced you are at doing those things, gathering data, making assessments, coming to conclusions, interviewing, the better you're going to be as an investigator. And it's extremely challenging work. It can be very emotional. There are times when it's highly confrontational because you are confronting people many times with evidence that they have violated company policy for their own benefit. And those can be very difficult conversations. So I would say another skill set is the ability to have difficult conversations with people. So at a high level, and I guess the final comment, then we can jump into anything else, is you do have to document the results in a cogent, well thought out report that lays out the facts, and is very clear and comes to a conclusion that many times, and this happens to us at Newmont, these investigation reports many times will end up in the court of law because the employee who has been terminated for their behavior may come back and sue the company. And you have to have an investigation file that ends and culminates in a report that the company can stand on to defend itself for the decisions that it has made.
Yeah, it's funny as you're talking, I'm thinking really a fraud investigation, it's almost like a heightened internal audit, right? And not that we shouldn't be doing every internal audit with that level of, precision and documentation and skepticism and all the things you're saying. It's almost heightened a little bit because of the emotions and the follow through and aftermath that can happen with fraud investigations. And the one thing I just want to bring out for the students that Brian said that I hope you caught is that the ability or the ability for us to add value as internal auditors is that we get to the root cause of why it even happened to begin with. And we're able to make hopefully that permanent process or control fix so that we're not going through another investigation. And that's typically what I say about any audit. But, I think it's really important that sometimes if the company's hiring fraud investigators to come in, they're just looking for what happened. And, almost they're not really even putting a Band-Aid on the problem. They're just giving management the facts. And what we can do is bring in that layer of, really fixing, solving, helping them, put more than a Band-Aid on the problem and get to the underlying source. And I think that is really where we can add value, even in things like fraud investigations.
Yeah, I would say to that point exactly, Joe, there's two elements of the report out in our investigation reports. One is very much on the subject, the person who either behaved inappropriately or has now been exonerated. And that is all kept very confidential. It's not reported publicly. It's very confidential. But then there's an element of the report that is very much focused on process. And so to your point, when we write an investigation report, yes, we're focused on is this person culpable, but we absolutely, in fact, we probably have more findings in our reports around process issues. How was this, especially on substantiated reports, but I'll tell you, even on unsubstantiated investigations, we may not have found that there was any bad behavior. But man, we sure many times will find that there are process issues that need to be rectified. So exactly to your point, Joe, that is a great point. It is an audit in many respects. And I will say, just like an audit ends up in management action plans and accountability to fix process, our investigations also have that same deliverable at the end. We may not give a final opinion because we didn't look at a whole process, but we will absolutely say, you need to fix this, this needs to be done. And it goes into the company's management action plan tracking process. So it's a formal process that comes out of the investigation as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And thanks for your stories and your insights. And on the last question I want to ask is, do you have any advice for students? Professional, personal, if you could talk to younger Brian Teets, what would you tell him, way back in the day? Anything for students?
Yeah, I think, when you're coming out of college, the world is, you have so many opportunities. And I would just say, make sure that you make lots of connections with people. I will say the old adage is, it's not what you know, it's who you know. And you have to be good at what you do. So take time to understand. If you're going to be an accountant, make sure you know GAAP, make sure you know the SEC laws and rules. If you're going to be an internal auditor, make sure you understand the principles of good internal auditing. Whatever you do, make sure you've got good core competencies. But I would say as important as that, if not more important, is really, as you venture out into your careers, make sure that you're making strong and intentional contacts within the organization you're working in. The opportunities I've had over my career are really because of the people I knew. Because when opportunities come up, you want people to think about you. And when you've got questions, you want to have people you can talk to, because you'll find out that there's always safety in the abundance of counsel. Don't make decisions in a vacuum, bring other people into it. So probably the best career advice I could give to young professionals is, you're not in this alone. People are here to help. People want to help. People at my stage in my career, I've got 35 years behind me. We want to help people. We love to see young people come to us with questions. So make sure that when you get into your organizations, and not even just internally, but externally through the IIA, opportunities to network in your profession or in your industry, really take advantage of connections, because those connections are going to help you be successful in your current job, but they're also going to create opportunities for you throughout your career. And you'll be glad. The more connections you have, the more opportunities you'll have.
Yeah, and I will second that, to say that the connections in the Denver community are just so valuable, and you never know who you're going to run into again. So it's great to keep building them.
Yes, Denver it's a big city, but it's a small city. And yeah, you're exactly right.
All right, Brian. Well, thank you so much. We really enjoyed having you, and look forward to seeing you again in the future.
All right. Thanks so much, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Appreciate it.